Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Bunker. It's time for another voicemail. Today's voicemail is from an anonymous caller. Let's listen to what they have to say.
Hello, Lloyd. At first, I would like to really thank you for the work that you do. And basically, I discovered your channel, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, and it really opened my eyes. So when I left the religion, I had a very, very strong view on that. And you kind of helped me to clear my doubts that I always had. So it's really interesting to listen for your ideas and research done. So thank you for that. The question that I have is more as like a generic type of question. I have not been involved in discussions yet, but I feel like that I could, and maybe many of us can be. Just to be clear, I am not disfellowshipped, I am inactive. So let's say I have family members who are still part of the religion, but they have never stopped speaking with me, and we have a very good relationship. Actually, I'm very lucky because my mother has never been this super brainwashed Jehovah's Witness, so to speak. So, she's supporting me whatever I do, but now I feel like that we can maybe have this discussion sometime in the future related to basically the worldview and the current, and responding to the current situation that we have right now in Europe. So after the COVID, of course, COVID never ended, but we have now a new event, new highlight, a terrible thing that is happening now in Europe, which is war. So, I heard quite a few times the anxiety from my mother that, this is one of the signs that the world end is, coming, approaching. We had the pandemic, now we have the war that could actually maybe become a third world war. And, it's one of these signs that have been prophesied by Jesus in the Bible. So I would like to be prepared not to argue, but just to have an honest, open discussion on it. So I don't know, maybe you have received these type of questions, or maybe you have thought about it yourself. I guess it's a very probable scenario. So maybe you have some advice, some tips, maybe some clever ideas that we could all actually benefit from and use if we are encountered with such discussion. So that would be my question, just to hear your perspective and maybe some tips on that. But really, thank you very much again for what you do, and hopefully you can answer my question.
Thank you very much indeed. I will do my very best. It's a good question, and one that I'm sure many viewers will relate to, this whole question of the last days. We've had a pandemic, there are natural disasters, now there's a war in Europe, which has the potential to escalate. World War III has started being talked about. I heard one person joke, maybe it was on Twitter, I can't remember where, I enjoyed the 5 minutes between COVID and World War III. Obviously, COVID isn't over yet by any stretch. But wow, yeah, these are interesting times to be living in. But there have been interesting times throughout history. There just have. I think, in a way, our generation and perhaps the previous generation or two have been very spoiled, because World War II, I'm making a sweeping statement here, I guess, but World War II was so terrible, wasn't it? A truly globe-encompassing conflict in which there was a Holocaust, millions died, there was true evil that needed to be eradicated, clear distinctions between, you know, the side of evil and the side that was resisting, at least in my opinion. And almost as a reflex, we had decades and decades of relative peace. There was still wars, there was the Cold War, the nuclear threat, various conflicts around the world, etc. But for the most part, certainly in Europe, and I think you might be calling from Europe, it's been an age of prosperity and relative peace. And the last major pandemic was pre-World War II, was arguably the Spanish flu of 1918, which incidentally, I mean, last I checked, is still a bigger killer than COVID, or was still a bigger killer than COVID. I mean, maybe COVID will overtake at some point. But the point is, there have been huge upheavals throughout history, whether these are pandemics, whether these are wars, earthquakes, you name it. It's happened. It's happened throughout history. And of course, you're going to be more interested in identifying the time period in which you happen to live as having relevance if you are a believer in a doomsday religious movement. Of course, you're going to fixate more on your time period in history than previous periods in history that have been and gone, even if they were frankly worse and more deadly. I would rather be living now, despite all of the problems in the world today, I would rather be living now than in 1943. No question whatsoever. I'd rather be living in 1943 than in the Dark Ages, than in a period in Europe where people were getting burned at the stake for possessing a Bible or for heresy, and, you know, plagues went completely untreated because no one had the faintest grasp where disease came from or how to combat it. You know, clearly we're seeing improvements, aren't we? Clearly, bit by bit, incrementally, there is a forwards momentum in terms of progress and prosperity. Of course, there are going to be setbacks, but broadly speaking, we're better equipped to deal with those setbacks now than we have been in centuries past. I just find it too convenient, to be honest, for Jehovah's Witnesses or any fundamentalist doomsday group to jump up and down about the time period they just so happen to have been born into. And I also think that, and I've said this before on the channel, if you're going to create a sign of the last days, if you're going to put together a list that is going to be an omen of Armageddon, you're surely going to choose things that are unlikely to happen. You know, you're going to choose to say, I don't know, let me think of an example. A country will go without war for a decade or something like that, or the world will be without war for a year. Something that is actually unlikely to happen. You're not going to write a whole list of things that are always happening as being a unique sign. There have always been earthquakes and natural disasters because we live on a planet with a moving crust and with a weather system. There have always been wars and conflicts. People have always been at each other's throats from the beginning of humanity, when we were tribes squabbling in the savannah, right through to now. Humans have always been at the throats of other humans. There have always been diseases. There just have. There was never a period in human history when there were no wars, no diseases, and no earthquakes. So how is this an impressive sign of the last days to begin with? Oh, I'm just going to list a whole bunch of things that are always constantly happening. It's like saying, at some point in the future, women will give birth, and and people will laugh at each other, and people will tell each other stories, and you're just listing things that are always happening. There's nothing unique about it. I've made this argument before, but maybe it bears repeating. Maybe you haven't had the opportunity yet to think about it on that level. Of course, it's one thing for us to have an adult conversation along these lines and recognize how silly it all is and how alarmist the doomsday rhetoric of groups like Jehovah's Witnesses is. It's another thing entirely when you're dealing with such a potent set of beliefs, such potent indoctrination, and particularly when you're talking to someone who is in the grips of it, who is genuinely convinced, and their confirmation bias is causing them to look at events around the world and think, yes, Jehovah's Witnesses are right, because they said that there would be wars and there would be pestilence, and look, there's wars and pestilence. But that's all it is, confirmation bias. I suppose, again, as I've repeatedly said, it's about being kind and patient when you're speaking to people, in this case your mother. When you're having these conversations, don't ambush them, let them come to you, let them initiate the conversation. And just ask questions. Come at this from a position of sincerely wanting to understand the reasons for committing your entire life to a set of beliefs. You know, if I'm going to commit my life to this, mother, I'm going to need to be convinced, and here are my problems. I'm not seeing anything happening now, as disturbing as the Ukraine war is, and as disturbing as COVID is, and how as deadly as COVID has been. I'm not seeing anything unique in human history. We were lucky for a few decades to not have quite the situation we're dealing with now, but it's been worse in the past. I'm sure if we look at history, we can easily identify periods in history when things were worse. And couldn't people then have been pointing at the wars and at the pestilences and saying, this means that Armageddon is close? In fact, weren't people doing that back then? If we examine the history of Christianity, weren't there groups back then who were saying that Christ's second coming was imminent? So just approach it from a position of sincerity, a position of love and kindness and patience. But as I've said before, you know, there's only so much you can do. And sometimes people just want to believe, no matter what you say to them. They feel they have to believe. And it's their journey. And it might just be a case of agreeing to disagree, of learning to live with the fact, or your mother learning to live with the fact that you can't be convinced. In some cases, that's possible. In many cases, Jehovah's Witness parents want nothing to do with their children if they stop believing as they do. But in rare instances, I'm thinking even in the case of my wife's family, it's possible for there to still be communication and for there to still be a relationship. So I would have as your primary goal keeping the relationship going no matter what, even if you're unable to convince your mother. And maybe as a bonus, maybe it's possible to use some basic street epistemology, basic logical reasoning, call it what you will, and at least help your mother to understand where you're coming from and that you're not just being awkward and you're not just, being some kind of contrarian and dismissive and in denial of the obvious. It may be obvious to your mother, but it's not obvious to you. And yeah, it shouldn't be too hard for you to express your reasons to her as to why it isn't obvious or why you're not persuaded. So maybe something in there is helpful for you. I do sympathise with your situation though, and thank you for calling in. If you would like to leave a message, the thing to do is go to speakpipe.com/Cedars, remembering to indicate clearly if you don't want me to broadcast your message on my channel, but that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for watching.